with the right link now, but thank you to everyone who is currently here. Thank you for joining this discussion today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chelsea Akers. I'm the co-founder of Level D&I Solutions and also the host for Gray Spaces, the show that has been airing this spring. Our focus on the show has been highlighting tough and contentious topics that often come up when we're discussing diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. And today we're specifically focusing on feminism and intersectionality, womanism, some of the kind of related fields of study. And before we get started today, I want to share a little bit more about the series. So this is the final episode in the spring series for TechLife Live. We're exploring bringing it back in the fall and would love to have you guys join us for any future discussions. So we'll put an email form in the chat so that you can kind of sign up and stay up to date on not only this show, but the other 14 shows that TechLife Live has produced over the spring as well. And I really hope you'll check them out because there's a lot of really cool stuff. Okay, so on to today. I have three awesome guests joining Gray Spaces to talk about feminism and intersectionality and the patriarchy and all these kinds of things. So let me introduce first Kimberly George. Do you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a scholar of feminist ethnic studies. So basically means we focus on decolonial movements and the connection between feminist history and studies of race and colonization, gender, sexuality. And I run Feminism School, where I work largely with those who don't identify as academics, but are really interested in getting access to the resources of gender studies, critical race studies. So trying to open the doors of the academy, which isn't a very accessible, the academy is not a very accessible place. So trying to make a lot of these literatures and research more accessible.
Okay, awesome. Denisha?
Yes, my name is Tanisha Franklin. I am a diversity, inclusion, and belonging program manager currently for an organization called HubSpot. So a lot of my time is spent focusing on diversity and inclusion and belonging and equity as it relates to the workplace. So that's where I spend a lot of time and like to nerd out.
Okay, awesome. And then Shannon.
Hi, my name is Shannon Palma. I'm a recovering academic. My expertise there is in how and why people get invested in stories, symbols, and ideas that just aren't in our own best interests. And then I also co-host a podcast called Once Upon a Patriarchy, where we take down Disney. It's basically Disney is trash, and it's pretty fun. And then I'm the vice president of continuing education for Her Academy, which is a Columbus-based nonprofit that focuses on reinventing the computer science pipeline by through K through 12 education focused on the needs and interests of girls.
Awesome. Okay, and I'm also putting their LinkedIn URLs in the chat. So if you want to check any of them out, send connection requests. I know that everyone here would be happy to kind of connect and continue on these conversations. And also, please feel free to drop any questions that you might have throughout the discussion in the chat on the side here, because we'll move into a Q&A for the last 10 minutes or so of the discussion. And then finally, before we get started, for the purposes of this discussion, we had talked about trying to follow the bell hooks definition of feminism as a movement to end sexism, sexist exploration, and oppression. But we also want to address that there are multiple definitions, versions, and experiences of feminism, and we'll start to touch on that in this conversation. So to start, Kimberly, I would love for you to kind of open the conversation by helping us to examine the history of feminism, and particularly the stories we've been told about contributions to feminism, the multiplicity, and feminism's relationship with intersectionality.
Thanks, Chelsea, and thanks for all of your labor to get this group together. So I'll just start with, kind of the premise of what I do is that we have like so many resources we don't use in terms of dismantling patriarchy and white supremacy, because in my context of the United States, we systematically suppress the knowledge of feminist history and feminist anti-racist history. And so our education system itself doesn't give us access to a lot of these resources. So as hard as that is, and could be a lot of grief in that for people when they come to recognize that, it also means we have this inheritance of work by feminist foremothers that when you read the work from the 80s or the 30s or the 20s, it actually sounds remarkably contemporary. So I think that the first thing to say is we don't, as a whole, really know the histories of feminist history, at least in my context, because of the systematic silencing of feminist history. So I think that there is a huge invitation there to center the voices of feminist history and realize the multiplicity within those voices. So some people situate feminist history in terms of suffrage, other people situate it in terms of movements for labor rights, which is a very different history. So I'll just kind of talk for a minute about this word intersectionality, which is usually when people are thinking about decentering what could be called white feminism, they're talking about Kimberly Crenshaw's intervention with the term intersectionality. But most people, I'd be so curious to show of hands if people know where the term comes from or what Crenshaw was doing. So it's kind of a word that gets tokenized but disconnected from its history, its context. And so I can talk more about that, but want to pause to see if you have any questions on what I just said too. Chelsea, can you still hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sorry.
Under the questions, if you
Oh,
put your thumbs up, if you're familiar with intersectionality, and that is a term that'll kind of give us an idea of where we're at in the discussion. But I think if you also, Kimberly, just want to kind of talk about that a little bit. I know that I am not super familiar with it, so I would imagine there are a few people on the call who could benefit just from learning a little bit more about kind of how
Yeah, one of the things I've been passionate about in my work at feminism schools, working with educators so that I can train sixth grade teachers and where the history of this term comes from, then they can translate it to students in their class who can learn the richness of these histories. So intersectionality was coined in two articles by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 and 1991, mapping the margins and demarginalizing race and class. And what people sometimes miss about what she was trying to do is she was trying to hold white feminists to account for centering whiteness in their narratives of feminism, but she was also trying to hold anti-racist spaces to account for centering patriarchy and maleness. And it's interesting because there's been so much uptake of the word intersectionality in women's studies spaces in the past 30 years, but less uptake in anti-racist spaces, which is something Kimberly Crenshaw herself talked about with the 30th anniversary of intersectionality in 2019. She said, how come this gets so much uptake when we're talking about gender studies, but it gets far less uptake when we're trying to interrogate patriarchy within anti-racism? So she really wanted the word to do work in both ways. And she situated the work within a long history of Black women's activism going back to Anna Julia Cooper. So it's a particular articulation of the intersection of race, gender, and class, less sexuality in the original text, but we can go back to see how triple exploitation was being theorized in the 30s and 40s by Black women activists. So we can, there's different words and different terms to talk about these intersections, but she's a critical legal theorist, so she was talking about anti-discrimination law and how it rendered invisible Black women and women of color's experiences. It provided routes for white women to advocate for themselves, and it provided routes for Black men to advocate for themselves, but it literally made invisible Black women's experiences of discrimination.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that definitely kind of helps me understand where she is coming from, and probably helps to explain a little bit of the schism that happened between white and Black women with the feminist movement, and why, you know, some of that gets separated. So when we're talking about education and kind of what people gain when they get access to the knowledge of our feminist foremothers, or what they miss out on by only getting certain access to maybe, you know, white feminism. What do you think about that? Or you know, what are the kind of benefits to having a more inclusive education?
Well, one thing is we often don't get the history of collisions within feminism. So this is something Barbara Smith, founder of Black Women's Studies in the US, puts a lot of emphasis on, is that yes, critique white feminism, but don't erase the history of coalition building work that's multiracial and multi-ethnic, because women put a lot of work into that historically and it has mattered. And so she wants us to hold that balance of even how we think about these histories. I mean, there's the best way to say it is there's multiple genealogies. There's so many kinds of feminism. And in a lot of these contexts, women weren't using the word feminism, but they were doing feminist work. They were doing feminist activism.
Okay, perfect. Shannon or Denisha, do you have any thoughts to add around that question of just what the history of feminism looks like and the types of stories we've heard?
Yeah, I'm always really interested. Well, just what Kim was saying about intersectionality in particular. My first experience of that, and this comes from a place of privilege, right? Like, and an identity as a white woman. But my first like lived experience of how important that concept was when I was working in DEI, and we had a situation where we had a senior leader who promoted white women and promoted Black men and was really abusive to the Black women on his staff. And there was no way that we could accommodate that with, or we could use the structure of the workplace to deal with the very specific, very targeted way in which he was being discriminatory. And so when I think about what Kimberly Crenshaw was really trying to do, like that, how important our policies are, and how important acknowledging intersectionality is in our policies, because there's legal protection around identity categories that don't actually encompass the entirety of people's experience. They're very, very limited. And how it actually works in the workplace is usually not that simple. It's usually a lot more complicated. So I really appreciate bringing that, the legal aspect of what she does into that conversation.
Awesome. Denisha, did you have anything to add on this topic?
Yeah, just really quickly, I always appreciate so I have my degree's in sociology, and I work in more of the corporate, like I said, D&I space now, and so sometimes some of the more technical knowledge and some of the things that I learned back when I was studying, I tend to forget. And so it's just really good to be reminded of the history of the word intersectionality, because again, it is thrown around so frequently without actually a lot of times knowing or remembering the context of where that word really came from. So I always appreciate that kind of historical reminder.
Yeah, I love going back and rereading the core text. And of course, it's changed. And I think Crenshaw herself is really enthusiastic about different kinds of application and what are the limits or possibilities of the term. But it's so great to go back and read those original texts. You know, one thing we can ask about the concept is it's produced within the United States, within a critique of US legal structure. And so when we're thinking about a transnational feminist context, so for delete feminists in India, what are the limits and possibilities of intersectionality? So when we're doing work across borders, we have to kind of feel out what does this term allow, but also what does it not account for in different contexts, which is just a vibrant conversation to be had. And maybe as also a segue, I think, into some things you're going to be talking about, Denisha.
Yeah, that is a perfect segue into my next question for Denisha would be, can you kind of start to maybe address some of the challenges around global feminism and the issue with maybe trying to standardize American or white feminism and then apply it outside of America and maybe white people and their experiences?
Definitely. So again, I've been working in the D&I space in some way, shape, or form for the last several years, and recently, so in my current role, I am working for a company that's global, and I'm responsible for programming and for making sure that we kind of have a pulse on what's going on from a global perspective, which was new for me and a new challenge. So when I was really thinking about global feminism, I think about the word global specifically, which I feel could mean two different things. So this is how I'm breaking it down to conceptualize for myself. So you have first kind of the global in the geographical sense, right? So like literally where we're at in the world. And then you also have global in the sense of just being all encompassing. So very similar to like this idea of intersectionality. So when we talk about global in the sense of geographics, or geography, I don't think geographic is a word, geography, I always like to think first and remind myself that broad approaches to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging, for that matter, are typically not very impactful. versus taking a more targeted approach. Again, kind of the reasoning that intersectionality was born is because then you're able to, maybe you're impacting fewer people, but your impact is going to be greater. And the reason that I bring that up is because I'm going to talk specifically for organizations, maybe in the corporate space. If you're in an organization that is expanding globally or has offices across the world, and then you also think about the diversity and inclusion aspect of it, it starts to get a little bit muddy. It gets a little bit tricky. So the conversation around feminism, or even in this context around supporting women in the workplace, it typically lacks that cultural context because, like we've talked about already, the movement really has lack of representation in most cases. So even beyond lack of representation, when we talk about, race, gender, sexual orientation, kind of some of the more common, I guess, things that we talk about. And then you think about what do those same things mean outside of the United States. So women's equality, I think, I know it looks and means something different no matter where you're at in the world. So I have several colleagues, for example, in Japan, and I have several colleagues that are in Singapore. So those two places, obviously they're both in Asia, but very, very different in terms of what equality looks like for women, and not even just what it looks like, but how we are going to go about achieving that equality. So I think about women who identify within the LGBTQ plus community. And when we talk about that, it's different in Singapore because there are literal laws against being LGBTQ plus openly. And so for us in the US, and we're like, hey, join this ERG, and everyone, like, let's stand up and fight. That's not the same thing there. Similarly, a story I like to tell of myself. So I was getting some feedback of like, hey, I don't know if you all are familiar, but the Olympic director in Japan made a comment about, oh, women talk too much in meetings. And so typically these are the types of things that we would talk about very openly. And we use Slack to talk about a ton of different things. So we would talk about these things very openly. People would share. And I got pushback because I chose not to talk about this publicly in our group. And so it's like, hey, we talk about everything else in the US. Mind you, these are people in the US who are giving me this feedback. You should be talking about what's happening in Japan. And my pushback had to be, well, they don't want to talk about that. For women in Japan, a lot of times the conversation that they want to have is more on how can we level up and how can we become better leaders versus how can we fight the patriarchy. And so that lack of cultural context really puts us in a place where we've got to be very careful about how we approach these different subjects. And just reiterates again that geographically, feminism is going to look different. Now, I know this is in the workplace context, but I think that there are many avenues that we could take this. And I think for probably a lot of us on this call, are practical ways that we can think about what we are maybe doing in our everyday. And so understanding, though, why those things happen is really important to have the context from people like Kimberly and Shannon, who have a really deep knowledge of the history, which a lot of us, myself included, don't always have that deep of a knowledge to be able to apply, which is why we also tend to get a lot of pushback when we say, hey, this is systemic. And it's like, well, no, it's not. It absolutely is. And without that knowledge, I would think it wasn't either because I didn't know. And so that's why it's crucial to have that. And then beyond that, I think about, global from the standpoint of thinking about all encompassing. So I'll shift the focus a little bit here and then talk about it from this lens. But to me, the immediate thing that came to mind most recently and selfishly is the idea that we really fail to acknowledge, I think, all aspects of those who identify as women. So a lot of times our efforts then lead to really fruitless attempts at increasing diversity, increasing inclusion, increasing belonging, especially for organizations who are looking to expand globally, like I mentioned a little bit before. But the reason why I think that's important is because, again, we take this broad approach. So it's like women are oppressed, so like let's do X. And it's like, okay, well, it doesn't seem like X is working, but why? Well, because, yes, women may be oppressed, yes, women may be X, Y, and Z, but how are different groups of women experiencing that and to what degree? So when I was interviewing, I think it's been a story, maybe no one else will, but when I was interviewing for my current job, part of what I had to do was to we release a diversity report every year for the last 5 years or so. I had to look at the report and offer my 3 critiques. So I was like, okay, do I want the job really, or do I want, how honest do I want to be here? So I chose a happy medium, but part of the question was, hey, based on our data, what would be the next ERG that you would start? So that's Employee Resource Group for anyone who may not be familiar. And so I went with a very unconventional answer, and I said Black women. Because if you look at the data, yes, we'll see that, people of color, specifically women of color, make up, what is it, maybe 15%. But if we dive a little bit deeper than that, we'll see that of that 15%, I don't remember what the exact number was, 10 to 12% of that is Asian women. So this is not necessarily an accurate representation of where we're at with this. And then even fewer for Latinx women. So I'm like, well, this is the group that we really need to focus on. And when we do that, then we'll get to see, one, we'll see an increase in diversity because people will hear about this and people will want to work here. Two, we'll see an increase in inclusion if you measure that, because we'll have people who want to stay here. And then three, like the belonging piece of that is that we will have people who feel like they are being targeted in that approach, and it doesn't just feel like lip service. So I know that doesn't necessarily cover, just the geography aspect of it, but my mind, of course, cannot stick to one pathway, so I had to figure out a way to throw that in there. But yeah, I think that when I think about it from a global standpoint, and this is something that it's still a bit new to me, and just thinking about things beyond the context of North America. I think it's really important, and it's become something that now I have to think about because it's a part of my job. If I'm not doing that, that means I'm not doing my job well. So it's one of those things where I think people tend to end up with not what I call, but what it's called, like diversity fatigue. And so it's like, okay, we're always talking about these things all the time. And I'm like, why the heck did I decide to do this for a living and get paid to do this? And it's really one of those things that's actually really cool, because there's always going to be something new, and there's always going to be more to learn because it's constantly evolving. So something that to me is very interesting, in kind of really I don't know if I would say the next step, but if we want to think a little bit beyond where we're at right now, I think that this is a really good place to start.
Okay, great. Kimberly, Shannon, do you guys have anything you want to add?
I'm still thinking about a lot of it, but I really appreciate your attention to the two meanings of global, because I do think that so much of DEI efforts are these like really blanket kind of overview, like one size fits all solutions that just don't work for people. And I actually remembering, this is tangentially related, but there's they did a study of representation in video games, or I think it was video games. And the representation that matters is not just people that look like you or that you identify with in a broad category. It's people that share other things, right? So that not just women or Black women represented in video games, it's like nerdy Black women, or it's other kinds of characteristics that actually say, oh, okay, like people like me, that means more than just this broad overview of a particular kind of category.
That's such a good call out. And I also, this made me think of something as well. So like I'm a mother, and so I said a little while ago, like diversity and inclusion means something totally different to me now. And a lot of times now, instead of focusing on some of the more common aspects, I'm focusing on that because that's what's impacting me personally most in this moment in time. And so, yeah, that's a good call out of, even within these intersections, there's even more intersections that are a part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think does go back to Crenshaw's theorizing, because she was concerned about intergroup difference. So to her, identity politics works to the extent that we do interrogate and give a lot of attention to intra-group difference. So we can have this category of women, but then the work is like, who is in that category? How do they even experience that category? And what I love about feminist history is that they had to give so much attention to thinking about the category and reflection inwardly, because they were trying to build coalitions. So they had to come to understand themselves and even the categories or labels that worked or didn't work for them, so that they could work better with others. And of course, we are also destabilizing some of the the binary categories of gender as well in feminist theory. Now it looked a bit different in the 80s. But I also just wanted to say, I loved what you said about perhaps fewer people, but more impact, because what I've really found is this work takes so much, and that there are certain people who are ready for it and really want it. And I think that is more effective than trying to bring in something that is required for everybody in an organization. Resource the people who are ready and have a sense of what's at stake, even if they're not fully resourced yet, but you can provide the resources when they're eager and excited.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And okay, so starting to kind of just talk about, the workplace in particular, what that looks like for women and bringing more women in. Tanisha brought up ERGs. Shannon, I would love for you to kind of talk about the importance of representation in the workplace, and kind of going all the way back to, I know your kind of work is in girls who are, pre-college, figuring out how to diversify that pipeline from the bottom, but what that really means in the workplace. And then also, if you could kind of get into a little bit about the toll that invisible labor takes and seems to kind of disproportionately affect Black women.
Yeah, so I wanted to freshen my numbers because it's been a long time since I looked at these reports, mainly because they're depressing. So kind of once you don't really want to look again. But McKinsey released their 6th Women in the Workplace report just last year. And they were tracking from 2015 to 2020, right? So the number of women in the C-suite had grown to 21%, which is not a lot, but awesome. Except if you deaggregate that and look just at women of color, it's 3%. Okay. And then the senior VP level had grown to 28%. If you look just at women of color, it's 5%. Also, that's not equal. It's just yay, past 25 for some women. And the other piece of that is that the rate of growth is really, really slow. And the gap is still the largest at that first promotion to manager level. Okay, so even if you look at again, if you aggregate all women, it's 85 women for every 100 women promoted to manager. But if you start pulling that back, it's 58% Black women, 58 to 100 for Black women, 71 to 100 for Latinas. It is not good. And that's only 38% of women or of managers are identifying as women, period, versus 62% identify as men. So those are kind of where the big numbers are, right? And where and I talk about leadership, and then I'm going to talk about kids, but I talk about leadership because it's really those 2 levels. And part of it is that women and men, and when I say women and men, I want to also just peel back one thing. We're talking about structural inequality. So we're talking about privilege and oppression. So we can look at numbers for specific groups, but you can also talk about white men and men of color, right? You can put other categories in there and have similar dynamics, not the same, because it is all very, it works differently for different groups, but some of these dynamics that I'm going to talk about are the same. And that is that from recommendations to performance appraisals, men tend to be, and I would say white men tend to be evaluated based on potential, and women and people of color are evaluated based on past experience. So you have to already have the receipts in order to be seen as able to do the job, versus, hey, you're smart, you could do this, right? And then also that bias is something that changes, an unconscious bias. I'm not talking about hey, I hate this person or this kind of person. I'm talking about unconscious bias. So that what you think somebody's capable of, or who comes to mind when you're who am I gonna mentor among the young folks that have started, right? That tends to also carry a familiarity component to it. So it's not just people like you, but it's also, even if you are mentoring people who aren't like you, the circumstances of your life can influence who of the people not like you find worthy of mentoring, right? So men in traditional marriages have a tendency to, and these are studies. This one's from Harvard. These are just studies. This is not my personal opinion. Men in traditional marriages have a tendency to disapprove more or have more of a negative bias against women in the workplace. And that leads to denial of promotion opportunities. Like, study actually showed this. At the same point when male CEOs have kids, become fathers, that impacts the salary trajectory of everyone at their company. When their firstborn is a daughter, salaries tend to go up. When their firstborn is a son, they tend to go down. Like, it's complicated, but the ways that we work are not separate from the ways that we live. Okay, and also those biases hold true for progressive men. It's not just men who are more conservative. It's also progressive men. It's just what you're used to is what you kind of see, right? So we have to be we have to pay attention to our lives and how they influence us. Okay. The other piece of that is we're talking about something like COVID, which has had a really disproportionate impact on working mothers and on Black women, whether they're mothers or not. And part of the greater rise for Black women who aren't mothers is because we also have the emotional toll of the racial violence that's been very visible in the last year or so. This becomes really important also because there is a disproportionate toll on Black women in the workplace. Women of color in general, but particularly Black women, tend to give a lot of labor, unpaid labor, to DEI work. And there's a Vivian Castillo, who's a wonderful UX designer, brilliant woman. She published her resignation letter from Salesforce in Fast Company. And one of the things she talks about is she was a rising star at that organization, but she was doing so much unpaid DEI work with employee research groups and things like that that was ongoing, that she was doing 2 full-time jobs. And if companies would, this is a call to action, compensate people for things like ERGs, work that they do for the organization, then that will really help with some of this. But they also just need to pay attention to the fact that not everyone in the organization is the same and is experiencing work the same way. So one of the things Vivian talked about in her letter of resignation wasn't just doing the PowerPoint. It was also all of the emails that she got of people's workplace trauma after she gave the PowerPoint, which were secondary, like re-traumatizing. Because as she read through all of them, she became aware of things going on in her organization. She felt for the people that were sharing this with her. And then she didn't know what is she supposed to do with these? Because she's not positioned with she's not given a position that actually can change these things, right? So just kind of covering a whole bunch of things in response to that. And I do have what I think is the solution is a focal thing, I can't talk today, but dual method, right? Like hit it both ways. That McKinsey report showed that 1 in 4 women is currently thinking about leaving the workforce or downsizing their career due to the impact of COVID. 1 in 4 women. We're already we were growing, we're not growing anymore.
Do you know what the number is for men? Is it
I don't. I would be really curious about that. Yeah.
I'm sure it's lower.
Well, generally, I mean, I'm sure some have done it, but it is lower. But it's a huge opportunity for companies to invest in more flexible policies at work, in DEI, and in this kind of custom or small group solutions that Denisha is talking about, targeted solutions, maybe I should say. And then also really to invest in K through 12 education, because a lot of what these problems are, tell me if I'm going too long. But a lot of what these problems are that people don't know how to work together. They don't have the social emotional skills to work across difference. to incorporate, like take criticism or feedback and incorporate it, to value the experiences of others and believe them when they tell them what when they share their experiences. And they don't have a structural understanding of racism and sexism and inequality, that they think it's about niceness. Like, none of these things are about niceness. We were all born into a historical context that we have to navigate. And our intentions don't really matter if our impact is harmful. So we can teach kids this. So we focus on K through 12 computer science education, but we incorporate equity and social justice learning outcomes along with social emotional learning in with our coding. So when they work in a team, they learn to give each other positive feedback, to accept feedback from others, and really look at their work and see how they can apply it. To listen, they do user research and they listen to their classmates' experiences and believe them.
Yeah,
Just believe them. These aren't hard.
like that idea of looking at impact, not just intention, because that's something that I've heard a little bit more recently, and I think it's very valid and very important. That what is the old adage? It's like the best laid roads were paved with good intention, or the road to hell is paved with good intention, something like that. So really bringing that impact piece in. Really quickly, Denisha or Kimberly, did you kind of have anything you wanted to add on that topic, or kind of respond to anything Shannon was talking about here?
I just had a quick, I don't even know if it would be called an epiphany, but you talked about like the unpaid labor, and a lot of times that comes in the form of people who volunteer to do ERG work, which again, I'm doing it paid now, but prior that was, I've always volunteered to do ERG work. That's how I got into this kind of, this space. And it's always been fun, exciting, and then I just really started to think about it. And like in a previous role, I was doing this work, and yes, it was energizing, but then a lot of the times I was spending time doing things like convincing people in legal that it was in fact not illegal to have a mentorship program for people of color. And like how I was thinking about how emotionally exhausting that was. And then when it came time for them to hire someone for diversity and inclusion, and I applied and didn't even get an interview, and had been doing all of these things. So I don't know, it was just kind of an epiphany for me, because I kind of always have been like, oh, I understand that this happened, but like it hadn't happened to me, like I'm exempt from this. But then when you really think about some of these things a little bit harder, I think it just brings it into perspective a bit. So thank you for that.
I'm sorry
Yeah.
you didn't get an interview.
Yeah.
They clearly missed out.
I love my job.
That's true. You're in a better place.
But I think this question of invisible labors is so key, and I also want to kind of tie it into a couple of other ideas. But sometimes you'll hear the triple shift talked about for women. So, working outside the home, working within the home, and then the triple shift for a lot of Black women, women of color, Indigenous women is dismantling white supremacy and settler colonialism and mass incarceration and being on the streets and doing all the labor of the protests last summer. And one thing I really try to teach about a lot is the labor relations of patriarchy is based on taking women's labor. The labor relations of white supremacy is based on not only taking the land and the waterways of Indigenous communities, but taking the labor of people of color and Black people. So if we want to shift those dynamics, we have to talk about labor, and the actual practices of feminism are around shifting the labor relations and making visible what's been invisible. And even just the emotional labor of I'm going to just kind of use a trope here, but of a white man in an organization or a white woman who's super defensive to recognizing he needs to change. I mean, that is an enormous amount of psychic and emotional labor to work with that defense structure. And there isn't really something on a paycheck often that says, working with a white man's defenses for 7 months until he came to realize that systemic inequality is real. Like, where is that represented in a paycheck? And the toll is enormous. And there's a lot of research within feminist history about the toll, particularly on Black women and women of color. And the toll is real, like health issues and early death. And it's really sad and horrible. And there's a lot of research saying we have to pay attention to the effects on reproductive rights for Black women who are undergoing this kind of stress within institutions and corporations. So there's research on the toll of this emotional labor as well.
No, I think that's a really great point. We're coming up on about 10 minutes left here, so I'd love to kind of move into the Q&A session really quickly. We're going to send out a poll just to see what your experience has been with, TechLife Live and this event. And please don't rate us too harshly for having the wrong Zoom link out there. But if you guys could just fill that out, it helps us make sure that we're providing engaging and relevant content. And you can just do that in the background. But I know I have a couple questions in mind, but I'd love to see kind of what comes through the chat. So think through those, send them through. But as we're kind of talking about identifying invisible labor, I would love to hear, what do, Shannon, Kimberly, and Denisha, where are good places to kind of look and find invisible labor? We've kind of talked about ERGs and running DE&I programs, especially if it's not a paid position. And so I'd love to kind of dive into like how we can try to start compensating for these roles or breaking this cycle. And I think each of you kind of have a different idea and approach around it. So I'd love to kind of go through that. I don't know who wants to start.
In terms of identifying invisible labor, I mean, I do think that there's a certain component to mindfulness, like of just mindfulness about what's going, like what your day-to-day looks like. I had a job once where like I spent a long time where someone always had to listen to our male boss talk through, like, if he was worried about something, you had to just kind of push away everything else you were doing for the day that was your actual job and just let him talk for about 45 minutes. So like there's small things like that can add up over time. And then there's systemic things like the doing DEI presentations as a volunteer, or like the labor in ERGs is year round. So that's a job. That's not like a couple hours volunteer work. That's an actual, like, that's a function within the organization. So there's some things that seem like they could be, even if they're not. And I'd be curious, Denisha, you're way closer to this than I am at this point. So when we were doing it, I always thought it should be like a termed position, like not something that's forever, but something where either if you're taking this on, then you don't have to, like, you maybe get part of your regular job redistributed, or you get a bump in pay, but it's a term position. You're not expected to do it indefinitely.
Yeah, a lot of companies, I wouldn't say a lot, a lot of companies are starting to talk about compensating ERG leaders. There are some companies that have started to do it in the form of like a bonus. So I know that some companies have started doing like a $5,000 bonus for people. And so, and that number is going to look different depending on the company. This is like a very large organization, but even where I'm at now, people have to apply to be a part of what we call our leadership councils, because I'm actually full-time running 2 of our ERGs, which is also something I think that's relatively newer in the space. So there's a couple of different ways, I feel like, but then you also think about like, okay, well, we give people bonuses, then those are going to be taxed drastically too. So like there's all these different aspects, I feel like, that come into play with figuring out how to appropriately compensate folks.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I was multitasking some in the chats, trying to read the questions to make sure we can get to some of them. But I'll just add, when I work with organizations, kind of the first step is actually coming up with language for the invisible labor. Because if we don't know the labor that goes into any process of change, it's not going to be sustainable. So it's coming up with the language for the labor, and then coming up with a way to talk about how feminist anti-racist practice is about shifting the labor relations. And there's a lot of work that just goes into even coming up with that language, and it is such a huge win for me when I work with a white man for 7 months and he finally gets that his impact on people has like emotional labor is on the other end of what he's doing, psychic labor, that when he acts in certain ways, that exports labor to people around him. And so just even developing that language and that mode of awareness, and then we can figure out compensation. But if it's just so erased, we don't even have a lexicon for talking about invisible labor.
Yeah.
Then the system works as it wants to work.
Yeah, I think those are all valid points. So I saw in the chat a question around the distinction between feminism and womanism. I know that when I was doing just some brief research on it, what we've been kind of shown and taught about historically with feminism is kind of how white women were lifted up at the expense of Black women and women of color. And I believe womanism was coined by a Black woman, I'm pretty sure.
Alice Walker, yeah.
Okay, and meant to be more inclusive and maybe kind of distance a little bit from the feminism movement because it was kind of just perceived to be mainly for lifting up white women. But please, Kimberly, Shannon, someone else who's more familiar with these terms, feel free to correct me on that.
Yeah, womanism was coined by Alice Walker, as Kim was saying, and it was in a short story. She was concerned by, yes, the exclusion of kind of Black women's specific needs and interests from like a white mainstream feminism, but also really wanting to have a concept for organizing that was inclusive of Black men and of Black women's role in their families, and then also of spirituality. So it's really been picked up pretty hardcore by Black feminist theologians, or Black women theologians who are womanists, not feminists. So yeah, that, and then Kim may have more on that.
Oh, well, I guess I'll just say that there's a need to use different terms to differentiate different kinds of priorities. So I would say when you're reading feminist history, read across feminist history, read Chicana, Arab, Jewish, Black, and these terms aren't mutually exclusive. There's Black Jews, there's, Arab Jews, but the point is read across many different genealogies and figure out how they're defining what feminism is. And one thing that amazes me, even as a feminist scholar, is picking up a new book by a historian and just having my mind completely blown by, oh, this is what 1930s Black feminism looked like. This is what they were organizing around. Just because so much of the scholarship is still emerging because the history's been so suppressed. So my mind is completely blown over and over by the different terms, the different way of differentiating, and also the collisions that are built between very different streams of feminism.
Yeah, so it sounds like the short answer is these are all very complex and nuanced kind of ideologies and bases for coalitions that just kind of focus on or appeal to or lift up different sects of the population and kind of maybe approach different like intersectional groups as well. And then I saw a great question come through as well around what hurdles are faced by trans folks in terms of feminism, and what does that distinction, if there is one, look like kind of in this area?
If we're sending resources, I'll send a talk. Kim Crenshaw's on a panel talking about trans activism and intersectionality. So that's just one quick answer that I could send that resource around.
I would say that there's so many different genealogies of feminism that it just depends on what genealogy of feminism you're dealing with. There are trans exclusionary radical feminists who have a very bio-centered view of what womanhood is. I would say they clearly don't know a lot of science, but about actual biology, but that's where they're coming from. And I would say most contemporary feminist theory, which is really, really different from feminists, right? Like this is like the academic thread, is trans inclusive, but and understands that there are ways, like lots of ways to be a woman. Individual feminists, like we all carry biases, like we can all be prejudiced in different ways. So there's different, like what you're going to encounter with someone who identifies as a feminist. That's not something that you can immediately know this person is feminist and therefore safe. You kind of have to feel out what kind of feminism they practice. And that's where that like all of those different genealogies and histories come into play. There's lots of people who claim that word, and not everybody agrees about what it means.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a great way to sum up part of the reason I chose this topic is because in conversations around DE&I, when issues of gender equality and equity come up and the word feminist comes up, sometimes you hear feminazi or that it's anti-men or man-hating. And for me, I really wanted to kind of explore just the multiplicity of the word itself. And I think it's a really great point to kind of note that there are individual biases that kind of carry through to different movements and groups, but that they're really, across the spectrum, feminism can and should be for everyone. And hopefully more of that academic kind of approach to it and where it is trans inclusive and works to equally lift white, Black, BIPOC populations up becomes more of the norm. But we're at time now. So I will say, if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to just send me an email. I'll write my email here in the chat. And I will share those with Shannon, Kimberly, and Denisha, or you have their LinkedIn's. If you want to reach out directly, please feel free to do that as well. But thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for the great questions, for your patience with some of the technical difficulties. And please stay connected. I'm so excited to kind of see new faces on here every month. I hope we'll be back in the fall. But again, just thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the event. Really good.
Yeah, thanks for joining.